The Predator's game. I've seen fear. Felt it pulse through my limbs like electricity. But never like this. Not this thick, not this cold, not in reverse. Because I wasn't the one afraid. They dropped me on Traskova. 9 with nothing but a pressure suit, a sidearm, an earpiece patched into an alien language protocol. My orders were simple. Observe the Vyr'atha hunt. Record. Report. And for God's sake, don't interfere. Stay at the perimeter. Command said. You're only there as a cultural liaison. This is their right, not ours. Right. That would have been a fine plan. If the perimeter didn't collapse by day 2. The Vyr'atha called it a cull. A ceremonial purge of apex predators bred in captivity and unleashed into a sprawling jungle dome the size of Nevada. Dozens of Vyr'atha elites dropped and armed to the fangs, cloaked in nanomesh armor and dripping with toxin darts and pride. I was the only human, just one of me, against all that, and somehow I was the only one still alive. The air was thick with spores and thermal haze. Black vines as wide as my torso slithered across the ground, alive with some parasitic symbiosis I didn't have time to study. Vyr'atha corpses lay shredded, their armor in ribbons. Their green blood pooled into steaming puddles. Human. Came a voice, clear, high, melodic. Female. Commanding. I turned, slow and cautious. She was perched on a twisted root, high above, spear glinting in hand. Vyr'atha female. Tall, scaled, regal in the way jungle cats are regal before they pounce. Her crest flared wide, eyes like obsidian suns staring down at me. You are unarmored, she said. Wounded, surrounded, the beast circles you. I glanced down at the cracked visor of my helmet, blood on my leg, movement in the foliage. And yet, she continued, tone icy and uncertain, you do not flee. I looked her dead in the eye, and I smiled, because I'm not the one being hunted. She blinked, then she saw it, what I'd set up, the traps, the bait, the sonic pulse emitters I'd cobbled from broken drones, and gutted comms. Everything in this hellhole ran on instinct and fury, but I ran on patterns, tracked the beast's heat trails, knew its movement radius, narrowed the kill funnel down to 20 meters. She hadn't noticed. She wasn't supposed to. The brush exploded behind me. Something massive, furred and armored, screaming in a frequency that pierced metal. I dropped, rolled, let the predator sail past me, straight into the snare field I'd activated 3 seconds earlier. Crack, hiss, boom. Electrostatic nets erupted from the trees, followed by monofilament lines that coiled like serpents and snapped shut around it. The beast wailed, limbs flailing, eyes bleeding, until finally it crashed to the jungle floor in a heap of death spasms and smoking flesh. Silence. Even the spores paused. I stood, slow, and turned to the female Vyr'atha. Her spear had dropped from her hand. She didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared at me. This lone human, bloodied, unarmored, alone, who'd just done what 20 of her warriors couldn't. Why don't you run, human? She asked again. Whispered this time. I looked up at her, still breathing hard, sweat running into my collar, because running only makes you easier to catch. She flinched. Her tail coiled, not in threat, but in fear. That was the moment everything changed. For her, for them, for the Vyr'atha Empire. The Empire's prize. They escorted me through the jungle in silence, not in chains, not at spear point, like a relic being carried through a temple of ghosts. 6 surviving Vyr'atha elites flanked me, not as captors, but as something stranger. Their body language bristled with tension, crest spines tilted backward in an unfamiliar posture I would later learn meant subordination. And the female, the one who first questioned me, walked ahead, her stride rigid, her gaze forward. I didn't know her name yet, but she knew mine. Terran, she said as we emerged from the tree line, her voice carefully neutral. You will speak before the first clutch. I frowned. That's your leadership? She turned slightly. Just enough for one eye to meet mine. They lead when we are civilized. This is not civilization. This is war. The camp was colossal. not a temporary outpost, but a mobile fortress of bone-laced steel and armored nests sunk deep into the jungle floor. Massive banners hung from spire roots, each painted in the blood marks of the fallen. Dozens of Vyr'atha younglings trained in formation as thunder rolled above, simulating hunts in low-gravity chambers, darting between energy pulses like shadows with claws. They stopped when I passed. Every single one. It wasn't admiration in their eyes. It was confusion. I was small, soft-skinned. My weapon was primitive by their standards. I didn't snarl or posture or bare fangs. And yet their strongest had fallen, and I had not. Inside the high nest, everything reeked of dominance rituals and pheromone codes my brain had no chart for. But even I could tell the matriarch was ancient, scaled in gold so deep they bordered on black, her mandibles curved like ceremonial blades, voice like vibrating crystal. "You killed the Grinmaw Alpha," she said, not rising from her throne root. "I did," I replied, standing firm in the scent-dense air. "You did what generations of our bloodline failed to do," she continued, her eyes narrowing. "Alone, unaugmented." Not alone. I corrected, tapping my temple. I had algorithms, tracked the Alpha's hunting cycles. I mapped terrain behavior based on sound return and heat scatter. I predicted its aggression spikes. The room fell deathly still. "You thought your way through it?" she asked, as though speaking of heresy. I nodded. "We don't fight monsters with claws and rage. We fight them with math." That's when the silence broke. Not with voices, but with shifts, movements. Nervous, uneasy. The Vyr'atha weren't stunned by my defiance. They were rattled by the idea that this kind of warfare existed. The matriarch's nostrils flared, her tail coiling once. "Is this what all your kind do?" "No," I said slowly. "Most wouldn't have survived. I'm different." That wasn't arrogance. That was history. The mission had picked me because I was ex-Black Site, because I'd been dropped into jungles like this before, just not with aliens watching, and because I had a knack for breaking predators without ever firing a shot. A male at the edge of the chamber hissed low, stepping forward. "The human mocks our traditions. Let us return him to the wild and let the jungle judge his arrogance." But before anyone could answer, the female who first found me, she finally spoke. "He did not mock us. He survived us." The chamber turned. Her gaze never left me. I saw the hunt. I saw how he moved, how he thought. The beast didn't kill him because it never saw him coming. "Then what do you propose?" asked the matriarch. Eyes narrowed. The female turned toward the center. Her voice rose, not just in pitch, but in declaration. "I challenge for his sponsorship. Let him be tested in the trials. If he lives, he earns passage. If not, the jungle claims what it is owed." Murmurs rippled. I blinked. "Wait. I didn't agree to any try." "Silence, human." The matriarch said gently, almost fondly, "You've been chosen. And now your answer means little." And just like that, I wasn't liaison anymore. I was a symbol, a question wrapped in blood and bone and statistics. And in 3 days, I would enter the trials, a gauntlet of alien tradition older than most human civilizations, designed not to test strength, but obedience to instinct, which meant I was already at a disadvantage. Because humans, we don't obey instinct. We break it. The trial that wasn't meant for me. The Vyr'atha call it the Gauntlet of Selkarn, a sacred arena older than their orbital archives, grown not built. It wasn't walls or floors or gates. It was alive, living, breathing, reacting. Each trial was custom grown in days, its configuration mutated by pheromone code and old world rituals, designed to match the fears of the one being tested, which made me wonder, what the hell did they think I feared? I stood at the threshold, wearing nothing but the woven trial robes, semi-organic strands that clung to skin like breathing silk. No weapons, no sensors, no earpiece. They'd stripped me down to nothing but instinct. I still had one advantage. I was human, and humans don't play by the rules of fear. The matriarch's voice crackled over the vine speakers. "Begin." The floor opened beneath me like a mouth. I dropped freefall through darkness and mist and then landed hard in a dense marsh, slick with glowing algae. The air was warmer here, claustrophobic, thick with scents I didn't recognize, but that triggered old parts of my brain anyway. Something here wanted me dead, and not because it hated me, because that's what it was. The trials weren't a fight. They were judgment. Above, in the spectator domes of the hive spire, the Vyr'atha watched in silence. The female who challenged for my sponsorship, I later learned her name was Kryna, sat alone, claws gripping the edge of the obsidian overlook. Observe his response patterns. The matriarch told her. He will break. All creatures break. Even humans. But Kryna wasn't so sure. Below, I didn't break. I adapted. First trial. Sensory disorientation. Sonic pulses dislodged my inner balance. Light flashed in impossible color ranges. The walls shifted. But I closed my eyes and felt the terrain through foot pressure, listened for rebounding acoustics, filtered the chaos into signal. I moved forward, not because I saw a path, but because I calculated one. Second trial, mimic predators. Chitin drones shaped like things I didn't have a word for, coded to imitate fear pheromones and attack weak spots. I didn't fight them. I baited them into the mutagenic pools, let the trial itself consume its own weapons. By the time I reached the third chamber, the arena stopped changing. It was confused, like it couldn't figure me out. The floor hissed open once more, revealing the final trial, an echo chamber of mirrors and ancestral illusions. Usually, this was where Vyr'atha broke, faced with specters of their failures, of fallen ancestors accusing them of weakness. It wasn't physical. It was mental. But I didn't see ancestors. I saw Earth. I saw the red haze of the Martian rebellions. I saw the craters of Europa, the ruins of Shanghai Delta after the orbital wars. I saw fire, friends lost, enemies silenced, screams and languages I hadn't heard in years. And I stood there, heart racing, breathing shallow. Then I said 2 words. Keep going. The illusions didn't know what to do with that. They weren't made for stubbornness. They were made for guilt, for submission. But humans? We compartmentalize trauma like we build weapons, aggressively and with focus. The walls trembled, cracked, collapsed, and I walked out. No scars, no madness, just me. When I emerged into Spire, the silence was seismic. No one moved, not even Kryna. I stood before them, unarmed, unbroken, and utterly alien to everything they believed strength meant. The matriarch rose from her throne, slowly. Her eyes, once sharp, were now searching. You, she began. You were not supposed to finish. I looked up at her, sweat clinging to my brow. Then maybe you shouldn't have made the trial smart. It learned from me, didn't it? It tried to change. That's the difference between animals and humans. I stepped forward. We don't evolve by mutation. We evolve by choice. The Vyr'atha stared as if seeing a different species entirely. But it was Kryna who broke the silence. He is not the one being tested anymore, she said quietly. We are. And the matriarch agreed. For the first time in Vyr'atha history, the trial had failed to break its subject. And worse, it had learned from him. They now had a choice to make. Bury the evidence, or change their empire forever. Echoes from the old war. There's a kind of silence that only happens when an empire realizes it may no longer be the apex predator. That silence hung thick over the Vyr'atha Spire for 2 full cycles after I emerged from the trial untouched. I wasn't paraded. I wasn't questioned. I was studied. Kryna stood as my sole guardian now, a title granted not by the matriarch, but by something older, the trial itself. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was with a kind of cautious reverence, like she wasn't sure if I was still human anymore, or something else. I didn't feel like a god. I felt like a fuse, waiting to ignite something no one was ready for. I wasn't confined, but my movement was guided. Armed Vyr'atha watched me from every walkway, their armor humming faintly with charge intent. I didn't blame them. In the archive below the spire, Kryna brought me to a chamber forbidden to most. Its walls pulsed with ancient script. etched not by hand, but by memory. Crystal pylons glowed in rhythmic patterns, playing audio echoes recorded millennia ago. These are the echoes of Selkarn, Kryna said, her voice low. Our oldest records, from before the trials were sacred. I raised an eyebrow. They weren't always. No, they were warnings, simulations, designed by our first ancestors to prepare us for you. She activated one. A projection swirled to life in the center of the chamber. A figure emerged, not human, not Vyr'atha, but something else entirely. Insectoid and long-limbed, with a body that shimmered like fluid glass. The voice that followed wasn't spoken, but felt pushed directly into thought. If the humans reach the stars, they will not conquer as we did. They will infiltrate, study, adapt. They are not built for domination. They are built to endure. Another pulse. They will smile while learning your weaknesses, bleed while tracking your strengths. And when the moment is right, they will not strike in anger. They will dismantle your purpose, piece by piece, until you forget why you ever ruled. I stood frozen. Kryna studied me like I might crack open at any second. This is from before either of our species touched the core worlds. Before we discovered FTL travel. My people were warned not of invasion, but inversion, that humanity would invert the hierarchy. By accident or by nature, I turned to her. So the trials weren't about survival. She nodded. They were a firewall, a test of who we still were. And now you passed through it. That night, there was a meeting. Not public, not ceremonial. Secret. The matriarch in the inner clutch. Kryna brought me in under protest. Half the council refused to speak my name. The others refused to meet my gaze. We must erase this, hissed one war chief. The trial has malfunctioned. It has evolved, countered Kryna. Which is worse, the elder snapped. We cannot allow a human to break sacred tradition and walk away as if it were a game. She didn't break it, Kryna said, her voice hardening. She exposed that it was always just a game, one we were losing. All eyes turned to me. I didn't come here to challenge your culture, I said. I came here because Command wanted insight. I thought this was diplomacy. The matriarch finally rose. No, she said, this was never diplomacy. Your people sent you here because they already knew. They suspected the trial's purpose. And now we see it too. She stepped forward, her ancient face suddenly tired. The humans were meant to be observed. But now I see. The humans were always meant to replace us. I looked around the room and saw fear not of death, but of irrelevance. I could have played humble, could have denied it, but instead, I told them the truth. No one sent me here to replace you, but maybe we're not the ones who should be afraid of what's coming next. The matriarch narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? I tapped the old projection crystal embedded in the archive scroll I'd taken. That voice in the archive? The one who warned you about humans. Kryna looked up sharply. Yes. I exhaled. We've heard it before. On other worlds. In other ruins. That species. Whoever recorded those warnings. They didn't just warn you. They warned everyone. Right before they vanished. The spire went silent. Because suddenly, it wasn't about humans. It wasn't about Vyr'atha. It was about something older. Something watching from a void. Something that expected us to fight each other. So we'd be too distracted when it came back. What watches from a void? We always thought the stars were empty. But that wasn't fear. That was hope. Because the alternative, the idea that something might be watching, waiting, that chilled even me. The moment I activated that ancient archive fragment in front of the Vyr'atha matriarchs, something changed in the spire. A new urgency crept in. Their ceremonial grace frayed into barely contained survival instinct. They didn't say it out loud, but I saw it in their eyes. They'd feared us for generations. And suddenly, we weren't their apex predators anymore. We were potential allies. Kryna met me beneath the inner nesting towers, where the low-born engineers maintained the pulse grid and spore filter systems. We didn't talk above anymore. There were too many ears. They won't admit it, she said, brushing a biosensor node clean with a clawed hand. But the warnings in the archives, They match what we started seeing in the outer sectors. Disappearing colonies? I asked. She shook her head. Worse. Intact colonies. Empty. No bodies. No decay. Just gone. Like the air forgot how to hold memory. I leaned forward. You didn't report that to the Galactic Concord. We did. They classified it. Said it was radiation flux, spore collapse, localized wormhole drift. But we know better. Something's hunting. And then she handed me the data pod. I didn't want to look. I did anyway. It contained footage from an abandoned mining colony on Kes Prime. The last transmission was only 11 seconds long. Static, then screaming, then nothing. But the playback anomaly wasn't audio. It was in the shadows. A shape, fluid and enormous, moved without moving. Reflections shifted, but not in sync with the environment. Like something watching from behind reality. My pulse spiked. We've seen it before. I whispered. Not in real space. In sublight drift scans. Long-range echo lidar. Glitches that only show up when nothing else is transmitting. I looked up. We thought it was a censored ghost. It's not. Kryna stared at me, her voice dropping to a whisper, so low I barely heard her. It's what the trials were preparing us for. The spire called an emergency conclave. This time, the matriarch stood before her kind and spoke words I never thought I'd hear from a species bred for domination. We can no longer pretend we are alone at the top. She turned toward me. The human passed the trial not because she is stronger, but because she is different. And perhaps different is what we need to survive. The conclave trembled. The old war chief rose to challenge emotion, but was silenced by the matriarch's personal guard. The room didn't explode in protest. It fell silent in agreement. That was when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about alignment. Species that had never once bowed to another were now ready to kneel together, if only to stay standing in the dark. That night, Kryna took me to the edge of the trial dome. The bioluminescent canopy shimmered overhead, and the jungle beyond pulsed like the breath of some great beast. She looked out over the expanse. My people once believed that strength was isolation, she said, that anything weaker than us existed to be culled or trained or conquered. I glanced at her, and now, she hesitated. I think we were bred to fear the wrong thing. I let the silence hang for a while before answering. My people were the same. We used to think war was a matter of who had the biggest weapon. Then we learned that it's who survives the longest after the war ends, she finished quietly. I nodded, and that's when the stars changed. Literally, the constellations above us flickered, lines distorted. A shimmering wave rolled across the sky, like glass warping underwater. Kryna stiffened. That's not atmospheric distortion. No! I raised my wristband and activated the emergency frequency. It's them. Static. Dead. No response. And then the jungle fell silent. Not quiet. Silent. No wind. No insects. No ambient pulse of the living dome. Kryna turned to me, crest flaring in primal alarm. They're here. I nodded, gripping her arm. Now you understand, I said, why I didn't run. And somewhere, just past the tree-line, a reflection blinked in a direction no light should ever come from. Breach protocol. We never heard them approach, because they didn't move. They manifested. One moment the jungle hummed with life. The next it recoiled, as if even the planet itself wanted nothing to do with what came through. Kryna and I stared into the pulsing tree-line. Her crest flattened in primal panic. My pulse monitor read 160 BPM. I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of not understanding what was about to kill us. And then it stepped out, if you could call it stepping. It didn't displace the earth beneath it, didn't bend foliage. It was like light had been told to lie, to form a shape that shouldn't exist, a figure so smooth and tall it bent perception itself. Blacker than shadow, smoother than glass. And worse, it reflected me, but not my current self. It reflected the worst version of me, the version that never survived the trial, the one broken by loss, hollowed out by failure. Kryna spoke first. It is feeding. On what? She shook her head. Fear? Memory? Meaning? I don't know, but it's copying you. I took a step forward. Then let it. I stared directly at it. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, and its posture shifted. It leaned, not like a predator preparing to strike, like a student. You're not here to kill, I said. Not yet. You're here to test. It didn't respond, not in sound. But suddenly I couldn't breathe, not because the air was gone, because it had filled my thoughts with silence. Not words, not emotion, just absence, like it was erasing possibility itself. Then Kryna screamed. One of the Vyr'atha sentries behind us convulsed, claws spasming. The shadow creature hadn't touched him, just looked. In seconds, the warrior dropped, alive but comatose. Eyes open, mouth slack, mind hollowed. No blood, Kryna whispered. No injury, just emptied. She turned to me. You said you didn't run, because you weren't the one being hunted. I nodded, heart pounding. I was wrong. A second figure emerged, and then a third, each one taller, smoother, closer to perfect reflections. One took Kryna's shape, another one of the matriarchs. But every copy fell off, less like mimicry, more like preparation. They were learning. We retreated back to the spire. Alarms blared through the canopy. Biosentries activated, deploying defense spores and charge pikes. Warriors poured from hive nests in full exo-armor. I knew what was coming, and it wasn't a battle. It was a harvest. They don't want our territory, I told the council once we regrouped in the war route. They don't want our technology. The matriarch leaned forward. Then what? They want our identity. They're stripping civilizations for their shape, their minds, their language, turning memory into fuel. Kryna's claws dug into the obsidian table. And when they're done copying us, they erase the original. The silence that followed was different than fear. It was surrender, fighting for its last breath, until the matriarch rose. We have relied too long on instinct. We worship the hunt as survival. But the trial has failed, not because the human passed it, but because the universe changed while we stood still. She turned to me. What would your kind do, human? I didn't hesitate. We'd build a trap they'd never see coming. What came next wasn't a battle. It was a gamble. We evacuated the outer hives, set up electromagnetic echo fields in their place, mimicking neural activity, memory spikes, emotion pulses. We let the enemy feed, but we control what they fed on. False memories, engineered trauma, fabricated emotions, pain that never happened, joy that was never real. An entire synthetic mindscape designed by human blacksite engineers and laced with neurofeedback loops from both species. And when the reflections began to copy the data, we burned it. The feedback loop imploded in their network, not destroying them, but confusing them. They stumbled, lost shape, forgot who they were copying. It was enough. Vyr'atha warcasters hit them with kinetic storms. Human plasma squads dropped from orbit. Our coordinated strike pushed the first wave back, out of the jungle, out of the trial dome. But not gone. They retreated because we'd made ourselves unreadable, because they couldn't feed on chaos. But they'd be back. And next time they'd adapt. Kryna and I stood over the smoldering remains of a broken reflection, half-formed, still twitching, data spilling from its cracked frame like corrupted memories. She touched my shoulder. You were right, you know. You aren't the one being hunted. I met her gaze. Then who is... She pointed up at the sky. Now clear again, no distortions. But something still watched from beyond the stars. They're not hunting species, she said. They're hunting weakness. We are the fire line. In every war, there comes a moment, a breath between battles, a pause between heartbeats, where you either surrender to the inevitability of extinction, or you set yourself on fire to become the wall that stops it. This was that moment. 3 days after the breach, the stars broke again. Not just bent or flickered, shattered. Every long-range scope across the sector collapsed with the same error. Signal void does not correspond to physical law. Entire swaths of space went silent. No comms, no echoes, no heat, as if light itself refused to report what it saw. The shadows hadn't retreated. They'd summoned others. And this time they weren't testing. They were invading. We gathered in the heart of the re-engineered trial dome, now transformed into something new, a hybrid construct, half Vyr'atha instinct, half human tech, all defiance. We will not survive if we fight as we were, Kryna said, standing beside me, not as tribes, not as empires. We must become something that cannot be copied, cannot be erased. The matriarch stepped forward, her golden scales dull with age and war. Then let us do what no Vyr'atha has done since the age of descent. She unsheathed her crestblade and laid it at my feet. I yield the right of command, she said, to the one who did not run. Gasps rippled across the gathered warriors. Kryna didn't speak. She simply knelt beside her. So did the rest. We called the Defense Plan Project Fireline. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't strategic by traditional standards. It was human chaos fused with Vyr'atha ferocity, laced together by a singular idea. If they can only consume what they understand, then we'll give them something they can't. We infected the very air with paradox algorithms, code that changed based on emotional input. Every weapon, every trap, every trooper ran off biosyncs tied to emotional volatility. Rage, grief, love, laughter. Every beat of the heart rewrote the battlefield. They tried to mimic us again. This time they choked on it. I watched in the front as the first wave surged through the breach in orbit. Fluid shadows twisting in impossible geometries. They fell onto our lines like obsidian rain. And then everything went white. Time unraveled in that battle. Days felt like seconds. Seconds felt like years. Vyr'atha warriors screamed war hymns and fought with the fury of extinction. Humans laughed through the blood, sang through the smoke, broke rules like oxygen. And I, commander of an army that didn't exist a week ago, watched the fireline hold. Until it didn't. One by one, sectors fell. Not to death, but to forgetting. Entire platoons erased mid-charge. Names wiped from records. Emotions drained like static from memory foam. And just when we were down to our last line, we did the one thing no other species ever dared. We turned the trial on ourselves. Deep in the dome's core, we activated the fallback. A living AI, human-designed, Vyr'atha-grown, built from my neural maps and Kryna's combat instincts. Its purpose? To become a living paradox. It consumed our pain, joy, failure, memory, then looped it into itself endlessly, growing more erratic, more human Vyr'atha with every second. The shadows breached the core, and for the first time in the war, they hesitated. They tried to mimic the AI's reflection, but there was no pattern, no clarity, no clean emotion, just raw chaos folding into innovation. They couldn't process it. They cracked, and in that rupture, we struck. Every surviving weapon fired at once. A feedback cascade ruptured the dome, igniting the atmosphere around the core with unstable entropy. A burn that erased not just the enemy, but the memory of being prey. When I woke, I was in a field of glass. Kryna sat beside me, armor fused to her skin, crest scorched and split. "Did we win?" she asked. I looked up at the empty sky. "No, we survived. That's different." She smiled, blood on her teeth. "Then what now?" I took a long breath. "We rebuild the trial." "Why?" "So that the next time something watches us from the void, it doesn't ask, 'Why don't you run, human?'" I turned to her, voice cold as steel. "It asks, 'Why ain't we?'" Epilogue. Months later, the Concord gathered, not as separate species, but as one coalition bound by fire and memory. The trial was rewritten into a warning, not a right. A living archive, a line in the sand. Humans were no longer observers. We were the fireline. And in the endless dark between stars, something shifted. The shadows still watched. But now we stare back.